The entire town of Millbrook had gathered in the dusty square, their faces a mixture of curiosity and cruel anticipation as they watched the mountain man stride forward with purpose that made the very air seem to thicken. George Cooper, the wealthiest and most mysterious figure in 3 counties, moved through the crowd like a force of nature, his weathered boots creating small clouds of dust with each deliberate step. The woman on the auction block stood trembling, her plain dress hanging loose on her thin frame, her dark hair falling in tangled waves around a face that bore the marks of hardship and hunger. Catherine Kim had resigned herself to whatever fate awaited her, but nothing could have prepared her for what happened next. When George Cooper reached the wooden platform, he didn't hesitate. He didn't speak. He simply extended his hand toward Catherine, palm up, fingers steady despite the weight of 100 staring eyes. The gesture was so unexpected, so tender in its formality, that the entire crowd fell silent. Catherine looked down at his outstretched hand, then up at his face, searching for some sign of mockery or cruelty. Instead, she found only patience and something else she couldn't quite name. With trembling fingers, she placed her hand in his. What happened next would be talked about in Millbrook for generations to come. George Cooper, the man who had never shown deference to anyone, who commanded respect through sheer presence and vast wealth, lifted Catherine's hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. The gesture was performed with such reverence, such unmistakable respect, that several women in the crowd gasped audibly. Men shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware that they were witnessing something that challenged everything they thought they knew about power, beauty, and worth. The kiss lasted only a moment, but its impact rippled through the gathered townspeople like a stone thrown into still water. When George Cooper raised his head, his eyes met Catherine's, and in that gaze was a promise that transcended words. He had not bought her. He had chosen her. The distinction was as clear as mountain air and twice as powerful. But to understand how this moment came to pass, we must go back to the beginning, to the day when Catherine Kim's world crumbled around her like autumn leaves in a harsh wind. 3 months earlier, she had been living a quiet life on the outskirts of Millbrook with her aging father, William Evans, a man whose dreams had always been bigger than his circumstances. Their small farm barely sustained them, but it was theirs, and Catherine had found contentment in the simple rhythms of rural life. The drought had come early that year, withering their crops before they could mature. William Evans had borrowed money from Scott Bennett, the town's most ruthless creditor, using the farm as collateral. When the harvest failed completely, the debt became impossible to repay. Catherine watched. Her father aged 10 years in 10 days as he realized what his desperation had cost them. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. The story of Catherine and George is just beginning, and what unfolds will challenge everything you think you know about love, worth, and the courage to stand against an entire town's judgment. Scott Bennett arrived on a Tuesday morning with papers that might as well have been death sentences. He was a thin man with calculating eyes and a smile that never reached them. Catherine stood beside her father as Bennett explained the terms with cold precision. The farm would be seized. William Evans would be given a week to find alternative arrangements for himself and his daughter. Catherine had known this day might come, but knowing and experiencing were entirely different things. As she watched Bennett's men inventory their meager possessions, she felt something inside her break. Not her spirit exactly, but her faith in the idea that good intentions and hard work could protect you from the world's cruelties. Her father aged before her eyes, his shoulders sagging under the weight of failure and shame. "I'm sorry, Catherine," he whispered that night as they sat by the dying fire. "I thought I could make it work. I thought if I just tried harder, wanted it more." His voice trailed off into the darkness. Catherine reached for his weathered hand. "We'll figure something out, Papa. We always do." But even as she spoke the words, she knew they were empty comfort. William Evans was 63 years old, worn down by decades of disappointment. Who would hire him now? And what could Catherine offer? She could read and write, unusual for a woman in their circumstances, but Millbrook was not a place that valued such skills in women. She could cook and clean and tend animals, but so could dozens of other women who weren't burdened with a broken father to care for. The answer came from an unexpected source. Patricia Martin, the town's self-appointed moral authority and Scott Bennett's sister, appeared at their door 3 days before they were to be evicted. She was a large woman who wore her righteousness like armor, and her presence in their humble cabin felt like an invasion. "I've spoken with my brother," Patricia announced without preamble. "There's a solution to your predicament, though it requires sacrifice." Catherine felt her stomach clench. Nothing good ever came from Patricia Martin's solutions. "There's to be an auction," Patricia continued, her eyes fixed on Catherine with uncomfortable intensity. "Several families have found themselves in similar circumstances. The town has decided that rather than let these women become burdens on charity, they should be placed with men who can provide for them." The words hit Catherine like physical blows. An auction. They were talking about selling her like livestock. "Now, before you get any improper ideas," Patricia said quickly, "these are respectable arrangements, marriage contracts properly witnessed. The men who participate are established citizens looking for wives. It's really quite civilized." William Evans found his voice. "My daughter is not for sale." Patricia's smile was cold as winter wind. "Your daughter will be homeless and destitute in 3 days. At least this way, she'll have a roof over her head and food in her belly. And you, William, will have enough money to secure lodging at the boarding house until you can find work." The trap was perfect in its simplicity. Refuse, and Catherine would face an uncertain future with no resources and a father too broken to protect or provide for her. Accept, and she would be handed over to whoever bid highest, like a prize heifer at market. That night, Catherine lay awake staring at the cabin's rough-hewn ceiling, listening to her father's labored breathing. She had always known that life was unfair, but she had never imagined it could be this cruel. To be reduced to a commodity, valued only for her ability to cook, clean, and bear children, for a man who saw her as property rather than a person. She thought about running away, but where could she go? A woman alone on the frontier faced dangers that made even this humiliation seem preferable. She thought about refusing to participate, but that would only ensure her father's death from exposure and starvation when winter came. In the end, there was no choice at all. The morning of the auction dawned gray and cold, with clouds that threatened rain, but delivered only a bitter wind that cut through clothing and seemed to settle in the bones. Catherine, dressed in her best dress, which was still patched and faded, and braided her long black hair with trembling fingers. She had not slept in 3 days, and her reflection in the cracked mirror showed a woman who looked older than her 22 years. Her father walked her to the town square in silence. What was there to say? They both understood that this was likely goodbye, that whatever happened next would change everything between them forever. At the edge of the square, he stopped and turned to face her. "Catherine," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears, "I want you to know that you are the finest person I have ever known. Your mother would be so proud of the woman you've become. Whatever happens today, remember that you are worth more than any price they might put on you." She kissed his cheek, tasting salt, and walked alone into the square. The auction block had been constructed in the center of the square, a wooden platform raised 3 feet off the ground so that everyone could see clearly. Catherine was not the only woman there. 5 others stood nearby, all bearing the same expression of resigned desperation. She recognized them all. Elizabeth Williams, whose husband had died in a mining accident. Megan Flores, whose family had lost everything in a fire. Kelly Hernandez, barely 18 and orphaned the previous winter. The men gathered on the other side of the square were a mixed group. Some Catherine recognized as respectable citizens, widowers looking for companionship and help with their households. Others were strangers, rough men from the mining camps and logging operations who saw this as an opportunity to acquire a woman without the complications of courtship. Scott Bennett served as auctioneer, his voice carrying clearly across the square as he explained the terms. These were marriage contracts, he emphasized, blessed by the church and recognized by law. The successful bidders would be responsible for their wives' welfare and behavior. The women would be expected to fulfill all duties appropriate to their station. Catherine barely heard the words. She was focused on the faces in the crowd, trying to read the intentions of the men who might soon own her. Most looked at the women with the same expression they might wear when evaluating livestock. A few seemed uncomfortable with the entire proceeding, but were present nonetheless, perhaps driven by loneliness or practical necessity. Elizabeth Williams was first. She was a handsome woman of 35, with capable hands and a reputation for excellent cooking. The bidding was spirited, with several men competing for her. She went to Wayne Clark, a prosperous farmer, for $47. Catherine watched Elizabeth's face as the gavel fell, saw the moment when she accepted her fate, and straightened her shoulders with quiet dignity. Megan Flores followed, then Kelly Hernandez. Each sale felt like a small death to Catherine, a reminder of what was coming. The crowd grew more animated with each transaction, as if the initial discomfort was wearing off and being replaced by something uglier. Finally, it was Catherine's turn. She climbed the steps to the platform on unsteady legs, her heart hammering so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. Scott Bennett's voice seemed to come from very far away as he described her attributes. Young, healthy, literate, experienced in household management. The words felt like brands being pressed into her flesh. The bidding started slowly. A few men offered tentative amounts, but Catherine could see the lack of enthusiasm in their faces. She was not pretty by conventional standards, and her plainness was made more apparent by her obvious fear and exhaustion. Her dark hair was lustrous, but it framed a face marked by hardship. Her figure was slight, more suggestion than substance after months of poor nutrition. The amounts being called out were insultingly low, $12, $15, $18. Catherine felt her cheeks burn with humiliation as she realized that she was the least desired of all the women. Even in this degrading situation, she was being found wanting. The bidding stalled at $22, offered by a grizzled man she didn't recognize. He had the look of someone who worked with his hands, but there was something in his eyes that made Catherine's skin crawl. Scott Bennett called for higher bids, but the square had grown quiet. $22 going once, Bennett announced. Going twice. That was when George Cooper stepped forward. Catherine had seen him before, of course. Everyone in Millbrook knew George Cooper by sight, though few knew much about him personally. He lived alone in a grand house on the mountainside, built with timber from his own land and furnished with luxuries shipped from back east. He owned vast tracts of forest and mineral rights that made him wealthy beyond most people's imagination. He was perhaps 40 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair touched by silver and eyes the color of storm clouds. What made him truly notable, however, was his complete indifference to social conventions. He attended church but sat alone. He conducted business with quiet efficiency but formed no friendships. He was unfailingly polite but never warm. The townspeople respected his wealth and position, but they also found him unsettling in ways they couldn't quite articulate. George Cooper had never shown interest in any of the eligible women in town, despite the efforts of mothers and matchmakers. There had been speculation about his preferences, whispered conversations about why such a successful man remained unmarried. Some said he was still mourning a lost love from his past. Others suggested darker explanations. Now he stood at the edge of the crowd, his presence commanding attention without effort. He was dressed simply but well, his clothes speaking of quality rather than ostentation. His face was unreadable as he studied Catherine on the platform. $100, he said quietly. The words fell into the silence like stones into deep water. $100 was more than most men in Millbrook earned in 6 months. It was more than the other women had brought combined. The crowd stirred, whispers rippling through the gathered people like wind through grain. Scott Bennett's eyes widened. Did you say $100, Mr. Cooper? I did. Bennett looked around the square, but no one else spoke. Who could compete with such a bid? The grizzled man who had offered $22 was already backing away. His interest clearly ended. $100 going once, Bennett called, his voice carrying a note of excitement. This was far more than he had expected from Catherine's sale. Going twice, sold to Mr. George Cooper. The gavel fell with a sound like thunder, and Catherine felt the world shift around her. She had been sold to the mountain man, the mysterious figure who had never shown interest in any woman, who lived alone in his grand house like some character from a fairy tale. She didn't know whether to be relieved or terrified. George Cooper approached the platform with the same measured stride he had used earlier, but now Catherine could see his face more clearly. His vast features were strong but not harsh, weathered by sun and wind, but not cruel. When he looked up at her, she saw something in his eyes that she hadn't expected. Kindness. He extended his hand to help her down from the platform, and Catherine hesitated only a moment before accepting it. His grip was firm and warm, calloused from work but gentle in its strength. As her feet touched the ground, she found herself standing close enough to smell the scent of pine and wood smoke that seemed to cling to his clothes. "Thank you," she whispered, though she wasn't sure what she was thanking him for. He nodded once, then turned to Scott Bennett. "I'll need the papers drawn up properly. Marriage contract, as specified." "Of course, Mr. Cooper. I can have them ready within the hour." "Good, we'll wait." George Cooper guided Catherine to the edge of the square, away from the crowd that was still buzzing with excitement over the unexpected turn of events. They stood in the shadow of the general store, and Catherine found herself studying her new husband's profile. He was handsome in a rugged way, she supposed, though his face carried lines that spoke of hard experience. There was something about him that suggested depths she couldn't fathom, secrets that might never be shared. "Are you afraid of me?" he asked suddenly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. The question surprised her with its directness. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "Should I be?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "No, you shouldn't be." They waited in comfortable silence while Scott Bennett prepared the necessary documents. Catherine watched the townspeople disperse, many of them casting curious glances in their direction. She could imagine the conversations that would take place around dinner tables that evening. The speculation about George Cooper's motives and Catherine's extraordinary good fortune. Patricia Martin approached them as they waited, her expression a mixture of satisfaction and curiosity. "Mr. Cooper," she said with exaggerated courtesy, "what a generous gesture. I'm sure Catherine will make you a fine wife." George Cooper's response was cool. "I'm sure she will." Patricia clearly wanted to say more, to probe for information she could share or with the other town gossips. But something in George Cooper's manner discouraged further conversation. She eventually moved away, leaving them alone again. When the papers were ready, they were married on the spot by the town's minister, a nervous man who seemed overwhelmed by the circumstances. The ceremony was brief and perfunctory, witnessed by Scott Bennett and two other men whose names Catherine didn't catch. She found herself repeating vows in a voice that sounded foreign to her own ears, promising to love, honor, and obey a man she had never spoken to before today. George Cooper's responses were delivered in his quiet, steady voice, each word measured and deliberate. When the minister pronounced them, husband and wife, George took Catherine's hand and kissed it gently, just as he had done on the platform. The gesture seemed to seal something between them, a promise that went beyond the legal words they had just exchanged. "Shall we go home?" he asked. Home, the word carried weight and possibility. Catherine nodded, not trusting her voice. George Cooper had arrived in town on horseback, leading a second horse that he now offered to Catherine. She had ridden before, though not often, and she managed to mount with reasonable grace despite her trembling hands. As they rode out of Millbrook together, Catherine looked back once to see her father standing at the edge of the square, watching her departure with tears streaming down his weathered face. The ride to George Cooper's house took nearly an hour, following a winding trail that climbed steadily into the foothills. Catherine had never been this far from town before, and she was struck by the wild beauty of the landscape. Dense forests of pine and fir stretched in every direction, broken by meadows where wildflowers bloomed despite the season's lateness. A creek followed the trail for part of the way, its water running clear and cold over smooth stones. As they climbed higher, the air grew thinner and cooler. Catherine pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and tried to imagine what her new life would be like. Would George Cooper expect her to share his bed immediately? Would he be kind or demanding? Would she be a wife or merely a servant with a different title? The house appeared suddenly as they crested a ridge, and Catherine caught her breath at the sight of it. It was larger than she had expected, built of logs and stone, in a style that seemed to grow naturally from the mountainside. Wide porches wrapped around the structure, and tall windows reflected the afternoon light. Gardens had been laid out with careful attention to both beauty and practicality, and she could see outbuildings that suggested a well-organized homestead. "It's beautiful," she said, and meant it. George Cooper dismounted and came to help her down from her horse. "It's home," he said simply. "You're home now." The interior of the house was even more impressive than the exterior. The main room featured a massive stone fireplace and furniture that spoke of both comfort and quality. Books lined one wall, more books than Catherine had ever seen in one place. The kitchen was spacious and well-equipped, with a cast-iron stove that must have cost a fortune to transport up the mountain. Everything was clean and orderly, suggesting that George Cooper was a man who valued organization and took care of his possessions. "Are you hungry?" he asked as Catherine stood in the center of the main room, trying to take it all in. She realized that she was. The stress of the day had made eating impossible, but now that the immediate crisis was over, her body was reasserting its needs. "Yes, thank you." He moved to the kitchen with the easy familiarity of a man accustomed to caring for himself. Catherine watched as he built up the fire in the stove and began preparing a simple meal of bread, cheese, and preserved meat. His movements were economical and sure, suggesting years of practice. "May I help?" she asked. He paused in his work to look at her. "If you'd like, but you don't have to. Not today." Catherine appreciated the consideration, but she needed something to do with her hands. Standing idle in this strange new environment made her feel even more displaced. She found an apron hanging on a peg and tied it around her waist, then began setting the table while George finished preparing the food. They ate in relative silence, though it wasn't uncomfortable. George Cooper seemed to be a man who chose his words carefully, speaking only when he had something worth saying. Catherine found this restful after years of her father's anxious chatter and the constant noise of town life. "Tell me about yourself," George said eventually. It was such a simple request, but Catherine found herself at a loss. What was there to tell? Her life had been small and unremarkable until today's catastrophe. "There's not much to say. I lived with my father on our farm until we lost it. I can read and write. I know how to keep house and tend animals. I've never been anywhere or done anything particularly interesting." "You can read and write," George repeated. "That's unusual." "My mother taught me before she died. She said education was the one thing no one could take away from you." Catherine's voice caught slightly on the words. "I suppose she was wrong about that." George Cooper studied her face with those storm-gray eyes. "No one has taken it away from you. You still know how to read and write. You still have everything your mother gave you up here." He tapped his temple gently. "That's yours forever." The simple kindness in his words brought tears to Catherine's eyes. She blinked them back quickly, embarrassed by the display of emotion. George Cooper pretended not to notice, giving her time to compose herself. After the meal, he showed her through the rest of the house. There were 4 bedrooms, including a master suite that took up most of the second floor. The room was dominated by a large bed covered with quilts that looked handmade, and Catherine felt her cheeks burn as she wondered about the sleeping arrangements. "You can have the room at the end of the hall," George said as if reading her thoughts. "It has a good view of the valley, and it's far enough from the main room that you'll have privacy." Catherine felt a mixture of relief and confusion. "We're not, that is, you don't expect—" "I expect nothing from you that you're not ready to give," George said quietly. "This marriage was forced on both of us by circumstances. I won't compound that injustice by making demands you're not prepared to meet." His words should have reassured her, but instead, they raised new questions. Why had he bid on her at all? What did he want from this arrangement? Catherine had spent her entire life around men who saw women as property or conveniences. George Cooper's apparent respect for her autonomy was so foreign that she didn't know how to interpret it. The room he had assigned to her was indeed beautiful, with windows that looked out over the forested valley and a bed that was larger and more comfortable than anything she had ever slept in. Her few possessions looked pathetic in the spacious room, but George Cooper had already thought of that. "There are clothes in the wardrobe," she said. "They might need some alterations, but they should serve until we can arrange for more." Catherine opened the wardrobe to find dresses, undergarments, and even shoes, all of good quality and approximately her size. "These were for someone else," she said, running her fingers over the fine fabric. "They were, but she won't be needing them now." There was something in his voice that discouraged further questions, a note of finality that suggested painful memories. Catherine wondered about the woman who had been meant to wear these clothes, but she sensed that this was not the time to ask. That evening, they sat by the fire in the main room, George reading a book while Catherine worked on mending one of his shirts. The domestic scene felt surreal after the day's dramatic events, but there was something comforting about the normalcy of it. The fire crackled softly, and outside the windows, darkness was falling over the mountain. "Mr. Cooper," Catherine said eventually, "may I ask you something?" He looked up from his book. "George. You can call me George. And yes, you may ask. Why did you bid on me today? I mean, why did you choose to participate in the auction at all?" George was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire as if searching for the right words. "I've lived alone for a long time," he said finally. "Perhaps too long. And when I saw you up there looking so frightened and brave at the same time, I thought maybe we could help each other." "Help each other how?" "You needed a home and protection. I needed—" He paused, seeming to struggle with the admission. "I needed someone to share this place with. Someone who might understand what it's like to be alone." Catherine studied his profile in the firelight, seeing something vulnerable beneath his composed exterior. "You've been alone by choice, though. I've been alone by circumstance." "Have I?" George asked. "Sometimes I wonder if any of us really choose our solitude, or if it just happens gradually, one disappointment at a time, until we wake up one day and realize we've built walls so high that no one can climb over them." The conversation was venturing into territory that felt both intimate and dangerous. Catherine sensed that George Cooper rarely revealed so much of himself, and she felt honored by his trust even as she wondered what had shaped him into such a solitary figure. "What happened to her?" Catherine asked softly. "The woman whose clothes are in my wardrobe?" George's hand stilled on his book. For a moment, Catherine thought he wouldn't answer, that she had overstepped some invisible boundary. Then he sighed, a sound that seemed to come from deep within his chest. "Her name was Sarah," he said. "We were engaged to be married 5 years ago. She was coming west to join me, but the wagon train she was traveling with was attacked by raiders. No survivors." The simple words carried a weight of grief that made Catherine's heart ache for him. She understood now why he had withdrawn from society, why he lived alone on his mountain, like some wounded creature seeking solitude to heal. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "It was a long time ago." But the way he said it suggested that time had done little to ease the pain. "I kept her things, thinking. I don't know what I was thinking. That somehow keeping them would keep her memory alive, I suppose. And now you've given them to me, Brian?" "Yes." He looked at her directly, and in his eyes she saw something that made her breath catch. Sarah would have wanted them to be used by someone who needed them. She was practical that way. The implications of his words hung in the air between them. By giving Catherine the clothes meant for his lost love, George was making some kind of statement about moving forward, about choosing life over the comfortable familiarity of grief. Catherine felt the weight of that trust, the responsibility of being worthy of such a gift. They returned to their respective tasks, but the atmosphere had changed subtly. The silence between them was no longer simply comfortable. It was charged with new understanding. Catherine found herself stealing glances at George as he read, noting the strong line of his jaw, the way the firelight played across his features. He was a handsome man, she realized, though his handsomeness was of the weathered, lived-in variety rather than the smooth perfection of youth. When it came time to retire, George walked her to her room with old-fashioned courtesy. At the door, he paused, and Catherine found herself holding her breath, unsure what to expect. "Catherine," he said, "I want you to know that you're safe here. Whatever you may have heard about me, whatever the townspeople might say, I would never hurt you. You have my word on that." The earnestness in his voice told her that this was important to him, that perhaps he was aware of his reputation as a mysterious and potentially dangerous figure. "I believe you," she said, and was surprised to find that she meant it. He nodded once, then hesitated. "If you need anything during the night, don't hesitate to call. These mountains can be unsettling for someone not used to them. The sounds are different from town." Catherine smiled at his consideration. "Thank you. Good night, George." "Good night." She closed the door behind her and leaned against it, finally allowing herself to process everything that had happened. This morning she had awakened as Catherine Kim, the destitute daughter of a failed farmer. Tonight she was Catherine Cooper, wife to one of the wealthiest men in the territory. The transformation was so complete, so unexpected, that it felt like something from a dream. She changed into one of the nightgowns from the wardrobe, marveling at the softness of the fabric against her skin. Everything in this house spoke of comfort and quality, luxuries she had never imagined possessing. The bed was soft and warm, with blankets that smelled faintly of lavender and cedar. But despite her exhaustion, sleep was slow to come. Her mind kept returning to the moment when George had kissed her hand in front of the entire town, the gesture that had announced to everyone that he saw her as something more than a purchase. She touched her knuckles where his lips had pressed, remembering the warmth and gentleness of the contact. Outside her window, the mountain night was alive with sounds she didn't recognize. Owl calls echoed across the valley, and something large moved through the underbrush near the house. In town, she had been accustomed to the sounds of human activity, the comfort of knowing that neighbors were nearby. Here, she was surrounded by wilderness, protected only by the walls of the house and the presence of the man who had claimed her. The thought should have been frightening, but instead, Catherine found it oddly liberating. For the first time in months, she didn't have to worry about where her next meal would come from, or whether she would have a roof over her head. She didn't have to watch her father's face crumple with shame and defeat. She was safe, fed, and warm, married to a man who had shown her more kindness in one day than she had received from anyone in months. The next morning, Catherine woke to the smell of coffee and bacon cooking. She dressed quickly in one of the dresses from the wardrobe, a simple blue cotton that fit reasonably well, and made her way to the kitchen. George was already up and dressed, moving around the kitchen with the same quiet efficiency she had observed the night before. "Good morning," and he said, glancing up from the stove. "I hope you slept well." "Very well, thank you." Catherine moved to help with breakfast, falling naturally into the rhythm of domestic cooperation. "You're an early riser." "Old habits. The mountain doesn't care about human schedules. If you want to get things done, you learn to work with the daylight." As they prepared breakfast together, Catherine began to see glimpses of the man behind the mysterious reputation. George was methodical and practical, but there was also a gentleness in the way he handled things, a carefulness that suggested deep respect for the world around him. When he spoke, it was with consideration, as if he weighed each word before releasing it. After breakfast, George showed Catherine around the property. The house was the centerpiece of a carefully planned homestead that included a barn, a smokehouse, a workshop, and several other outbuildings. Gardens provided vegetables and herbs, while fruit trees promised abundance in the proper season. A clear stream ran through the property, providing fresh water and power for a small mill that George had constructed to grind grain. "You built all this yourself?" Catherine asked, awed by the scope of the operation. "Most of it. I had help with some of the heavier construction, but I designed and supervised everything." There was quiet pride in his voice, the satisfaction of a man who had created something lasting with his own hands. Catherine could see why he had chosen this location. The house was positioned to take advantage of both the view and the natural features of the land. It was protected from the worst weather by the mountain itself, but open to the south for light and warmth. Every detail showed careful planning and deep understanding of how to live in harmony with the wilderness. "It must get lonely," she observed as they walked along the stream. "It did," George admitted, "but loneliness was preferable to the alternative." "Which was?" He was quiet for a moment, watching the water flow over the rocks. "Living among people who see you as either a threat or an opportunity. In town, I was either the dangerous hermit to be feared or the wealthy bachelor to be pursued. Neither role left much room for genuine human connection." Catherine understood that feeling all too well. "So you withdrew completely?" "It seemed like the wisest choice at the time. I had everything I needed to be a self-sufficient. I could trade for what I couldn't produce myself. I convinced myself that solitude was a form of freedom." "And now?" George turned to look at her, and Catherine saw something in his expression that made her pulse quicken. "Now I'm beginning to remember what I gave up in exchange for that freedom." The days that followed settled into a comfortable routine. Catherine took over most of the household management, finding satisfaction in bringing order and efficiency to the domestic side of George's life. She was a good cook, and George seemed to appreciate having varied meals after years of bachelor fare. She mended his clothes, organized his books, and gradually began to put her own stamp on the house. George, for his part, included Catherine in the broader operations of the homestead. He taught her about the livestock, showed her how the mill worked, and explained his plans for expanding the orchards. Catherine found herself fascinated by the complexity of his operation and impressed by his knowledge of everything from animal husbandry to engineering. What surprised her most was how naturally they worked together. Despite their vastly different backgrounds, they seemed to complement each other's strengths. George's practical knowledge combined well with Catherine's organizational skills and attention to detail. They developed an easy communication, often understanding each other's intentions without need for lengthy explanations. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, reading or working on various projects. George was teaching Catherine about the business side of the homestead, showing her his ledgers and explaining how he managed his various enterprises. Catherine, in turn, shared stories from her reading, bringing life to the books that had been mere objects on his shelves. "You have a gift for storytelling," George observed one evening after Catherine had finished recounting a particularly dramatic passage from a novel. "My mother used to say that stories were how we made sense of the world," Catherine replied. "She would tell me tales when I was small, mixing fairy stories with family history until I couldn't tell where truth ended and imagination began." Perhaps that's the point. Maybe the distinction isn't as important as we think. Catherine looked at him curiously. "What do you mean?" "The stories we tell ourselves about our lives, about who we are and what we're capable of becoming. Are they true or are they fiction? Does it matter as long as they help us find meaning and direction?" It was a profound observation, and Catherine found herself thinking about it long after they had said goodnight. What stories had she been telling herself about her own life? That she was plain and unremarkable, worthy only of charity or pity? That her circumstances defined her possibilities? Living with George was forcing her to reconsider many of her assumptions about herself. He treated her as an intelligent partner, sought her opinions on important matters, and seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts and observations. Under his respectful attention, Catherine began to see herself differently. She was still the same person who had stood on that auction block, but her understanding of her own worth was beginning to shift. 3 weeks after their marriage, they made their first trip to town together for supplies. Catherine felt nervous about facing the townspeople as George Cooper's wife. Knowing that their marriage would be the subject of intense speculation and gossip, she dressed carefully in one of her better dresses and tried to prepare herself for whatever reception awaited them. The reaction was everything she had expected and more. Conversation stopped when they entered the general store. Women whispered behind their hands while men studied George with a new interest, as if marriage had somehow changed his fundamental nature. Catherine felt the weight of their stares and tried to maintain her composure. Patricia Martin was among the first to approach them, her smile brittle with false warmth. "Mrs. Cooper," she said, emphasizing the title. "How lovely to see you. I trust you're settling in well?" "Very well, thank you," Catherine replied, keeping her voice steady. "And Mr. Cooper, what a transformation marriage has worked on you. You look positively domesticated." George's response was coolly polite. "Marriage agrees with me, Mrs. Martin." Patricia's eyes glittered with curiosity. "I'm sure it does. Catherine is such a fortunate girl. To go from such desperate circumstances to such prosperity, it's quite the fairy tale, isn't it?" The implication was clear. Catherine had been rescued from poverty by a wealthy man's charity, and she should be appropriately grateful for her good fortune. Catherine felt her cheeks burn with humiliation, but before she could respond, George stepped closer to her side. "Catherine is the fortunate one in this marriage," he said quietly, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent store. "I'm the one who should be grateful." The simple statement sent ripples of shock through the assembled townspeople. George Cooper, the wealthy and mysterious mountain man, was publicly declaring that his plain wife was a prize he was lucky to have won. It challenged every assumption about power, beauty, and worth that governed their small society. Patricia Martin's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. She had clearly expected George to accept the narrative that he was Catherine's benefactor. that their marriage was an act of charity rather than choice. His refusal to play that role left her scrambling for a response. How, how romantic, she finally managed, her voice weak with confusion. George placed his hand on the small of Catherine's back, a gesture of support and possession that was unmistakably protective. Romance has nothing to do with it, he said. It's simple truth. They completed their shopping in relative silence, with the other customers giving them a wide berth. Catherine felt the weight of speculation following them, but George's steady presence at her side made her feel stronger than she had in months. As they loaded their supplies into the wagon, she found her voice. Thank you, she said quietly. For what? For defending me, for making it clear that you don't see me as a charity case. George paused in securing the supplies and looked at her directly. Catherine, I need you to understand something. What I said in there wasn't kindness or gallantry. It was the truth. You've brought more to my life in 3 weeks than I had in the 5 years before you came. The sincerity in his voice made Catherine's heart skip. I don't understand. What have I brought? I'm just me. Your warmth where there was coldness, your laughter where there was silence, your hope where there was resignation. George's voice was low, meant only for her ears. You've made my house into a home, Catherine. That's not something money can buy. The ride back to the mountain was quiet, but it was a different kind of silence than they had shared before. Catherine found herself acutely aware of George's presence beside her on the wagon seat, of the way his hands held the reins with easy competence, of the clean scent of soap and pine that seemed to surround him. Something had shifted between them in that moment at the general store. George's public declaration had been more than a defense of her dignity. It had been an acknowledgement of feelings that had been growing quietly between them for weeks. Catherine felt the change like a physical presence, thrilling and terrifying at the same time. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Catherine found it difficult to concentrate on her mending. She kept stealing glances at George, seeing him with new eyes. He was reading, his face relaxed in the firelight, and Catherine found herself studying the strong line of his jaw, the way his dark hair fell across his forehead, the gentle curve of his mouth. As if sensing her attention, George looked up from his book. Their eyes met across the space between their chairs, and Catherine felt something electric pass between them. Neither of them spoke, but the air seemed to thicken with unspoken possibilities. Catherine, George said finally, his voice rougher than usual. Yes? He seemed to struggle with whatever he wanted to say, then shook his head slightly. Nothing, it's late. Perhaps we should retire. But neither of them moved. They sat looking at each other in the flickering firelight, and Catherine felt as though they were balanced on the edge of some momentous decision. She could see the want in George's eyes, carefully controlled, but unmistakably present. She could also see his restraint, his determination not to push her faster than she was ready to go. The realization that he wanted her, truly wanted her, and not just the convenience of a wife, was intoxicating. Catherine had never thought of herself as desirable, had never imagined that a man like George Cooper might look at her with hunger barely held in check. George, she said softly. Yes? I'm not afraid anymore. The words hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning that went far beyond their surface simplicity. George's book slipped from his hands as he leaned forward in his chair, his eyes never leaving her face. Catherine, you don't have to. I know I don't have to. I want to. The admission surprised her with its boldness, but it was the truth. Over the past weeks, her feelings for George had evolved from gratitude to respect to something deeper and more complex. She admired his strength, his kindness, his quiet intelligence. She felt safe with him in ways that went beyond mere physical protection. And yes, she was beginning to love him, though she wasn't sure she was ready to name that feeling yet. George rose from his chair and crossed to where Catherine sat. He knelt beside her chair, bringing his face level with hers, and reached up to cup her cheek in his hand. His touch was gentle, reverent, as if she were something precious that might break. Are you certain? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Instead of answering with words, Catherine leaned into his touch, turning her face to press a soft kiss to his palm. The gesture was small but unmistakably intimate, a clear signal of her consent and desire. George's breath caught, and for a moment they simply looked at each other, acknowledging the step they were about to take. Then he leaned forward and kissed her, softly at first, then with growing passion as Catherine responded to his touch. The kiss was everything Catherine had never dared to hope for. There was desire in it, yes, but also tenderness, respect, and something deeper that made her heart race with possibility. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "Catherine," George murmured against her lips, "I want you to know that whatever happens between us, it's your choice. Always your choice." The words were exactly what Catherine needed to hear. George was offering her agency in their relationship, the power to set boundaries and make decisions about her own body and heart. After a lifetime of having choices made for her by circumstances and other people's needs, the gift of autonomy was precious beyond measure. "I choose you," she whispered, and meant it with every fiber of her being. What followed was a night of discovery and gentle passion that transformed their marriage from a convenient arrangement into something real and profound. George was a patient and considerate lover, attentive to Catherine's responses and careful not to overwhelm her with the intensity of his own desire. He seemed to understand that this was new territory for her, that trust was still fragile and needed to be nurtured rather than demanded. In the days that followed, their relationship deepened in ways that surprised them both. The physical intimacy had opened doors to emotional intimacy that neither had expected. They began to share stories from their past, dreams for the future, fears and hopes they had never voiced to another soul. Catherine learned that George had grown up poor in the East, that his wealth had come from a combination of hard work, smart investments, and a talent for seeing opportunities that others missed. He had come west not seeking adventure, but fleeing memories of a childhood marked by his father's drinking and his mother's quiet desperation. The mountains had offered him peace and the chance to build something lasting with his own hands. George learned that Catherine's apparent resignation to her fate masked a fierce determination to survive and find meaning in whatever circumstances life presented. Her mother's death when Catherine was 12 had forced her to become the adult in their small family, caring for her increasingly fragile father while maintaining the fiction that he was still the protector and provider. The auction had been the culmination of years of slowly diminishing options, but Catherine had faced it with courage that George found both heartbreaking and inspiring. "You're stronger than you know," he told her one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the valley in shades of gold and crimson. "I don't feel strong," Catherine replied. "I feel like I've been blown around by circumstances my whole life, never really in control of anything." "Strength isn't about control," George said thoughtfully. "It's about endurance. It's about bending without breaking, adapting without losing your essential self. You've done that through hardships that would have destroyed weaker people." Catherine considered his words, seeing her own experiences through his eyes. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps survival itself was a form of strength, and perhaps she had been stronger than she realized all along. Their happiness was not destined to remain undisturbed. 6 weeks after their marriage, trouble came calling in the form of Wayne Clark, the farmer who had purchased Elizabeth Williams at the auction. Wayne was a hard man who had grown harder since his first wife's death, and he had not been pleased with his new bride's performance. He arrived at the Cooper homestead on a cold morning in late October, his face flushed with anger and something that might have been drink. George was in the workshop, and Catherine was hanging laundry when Wayne rode up to the house. "Mrs. Cooper," Wayne called out, his voice carrying a note of mockery. "Fancy meeting you here, living like a queen, while the rest of us deal with reality." Catherine felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. She had heard rumors about Wayne's treatment of Elizabeth, whispers that he was demanding and cruel, that Elizabeth had been seen in town with bruises she claimed came from falls and accidents. Now, seeing the ugly expression on Wayne's face, Catherine believed those rumors. "Mr. Clark," she said carefully, continuing to hang clothes as if his presence didn't alarm her. "What brings you here?" "Just wanted to see how the other half lives," Wayne said, dismounting from his horse and moving closer. "Must be nice having a husband who treats you like a precious flower instead of expecting you to earn your keep." "I earn my keep," Catherine replied quietly, but her heart was beginning to race. Wayne was standing too close, and she could smell whiskey on his breath despite the early hour. Do you now? And how exactly do you do that, Mrs. Cooper? Because from where I stand, it looks like you hit the jackpot while the rest of us got stuck with the leftovers. Catherine took a step back, but Wayne matched her movement. She was beginning to feel trapped between him and the clothesline, and George was too far away to hear if she called for help. Elizabeth Williams is a fine woman, Catherine said, trying to redirect Wayne's anger. You're fortunate to have her. Wayne's laugh was ugly. Fortunate, is that what you call it? She's worn out, used up, and she acts like she's doing me a favor by sharing my bed, not like some women who know how to show proper appreciation for a man's generosity. The implication in his words made Catherine's skin crawl. Wayne was not just angry about his own situation. He was resentful of what he perceived as Catherine's undeserved good fortune. In his twisted logic, she owed him something, some acknowledgement of his superiority, or perhaps something more tangible. I think you should leave, Catherine said, trying to keep her voice steady. Do you? Well, that's too bad because I'm not ready to go yet. You see, I've been thinking about that auction, about how Cooper bid so high for damaged goods. Makes a man wonder what he saw that the rest of us missed. Wayne reached out as if to touch Catherine's face, and she jerked away instinctively. The movement seemed to inflame him further, and his expression turned dangerous. Don't be unfriendly, Mrs. Cooper. I'm just trying to understand what makes you so special. Maybe if you showed me, I could go back to Elizabeth with a better attitude. Catherine opened her mouth to scream for George, but Wayne was faster. His hand clamped over her mouth while his other arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her against him with bruising force. Catherine struggled, but Wayne was larger and stronger, and he seemed to enjoy her fear. That's more like it, he breathed against her ear. I like a woman with some fight in her. Elizabeth just lies there like a dead fish. Catherine bit down hard on Wayne's palm, and he jerked his hand away with a curse. She used the momentary freedom to scream George's name at the top of her lungs, hoping her voice would carry to the workshop. Wayne backhanded her across the face, the blow hard enough to split her lip and send stars dancing across her vision. Shut up, you little whore. Your husband can't protect you forever. But Wayne was wrong about that. George appeared around the corner of the house like an avenging angel, moving faster than Catherine had ever seen him move. He took in the situation at a glance. Catherine's split lip, Wayne's guilty expression, the torn fabric of her dress where Wayne had grabbed her. What happened next was swift and brutal. George covered the distance between them in 3 long strides, and his fist connected with Wayne's jaw with a sound like an axe hitting wood. Wayne went down hard, blood streaming from his nose, but George wasn't finished. He hauled the smaller man to his feet and hit him again, this time in the stomach, doubling Wayne over. You touched my wife, George said, his voice deadly quiet. You put your hands on her without her permission. Wayne tried to speak, but George's hand closed around his throat, cutting off his words. Catherine had never seen George violent before, had never imagined him capable of such controlled fury. It was both terrifying and oddly comforting to see the lengths he would go to protect her. If you ever come near her again, George continued, his voice never rising above a conversational tone, I will kill you. Do you understand me? Wayne nodded frantically, his face turning purple from lack of air. George released him, and Wayne collapsed to his knees, gasping and coughing. Get off my land, George ordered, and don't come back. Wayne struggled to his feet, blood still streaming from his nose. He looked at Catherine with hatred and something that might have been promise, as if this wasn't over between them. Then he stumbled to his horse and rode away, weaving slightly in the saddle. George turned to Catherine, his fury instantly replaced by concern. Are you hurt? Did he do more than hit you? No, Catherine said quickly, though her lip was throbbing and she could taste blood. You got here in time. George's hands were gentle as he examined her face, his touch a stark contrast to the violence he had just displayed. I should have killed him, he said quietly. No, you did the right thing. Killing him would only bring more trouble. But even as Catherine spoke the words, she wondered if she was right. Wayne Clark was not a man to forgive or forget, and the humiliation George had just dealt him would fester like an infected wound. She had a feeling this was not the end of their troubles with him. George helped Catherine into the house and tended to her split lip with careful attention. His hands shook slightly as he cleaned the blood away, and Catherine realized that his calm exterior was hiding deep emotion. "I'm sorry," he said as he worked. "I should have been closer. I should have been watching." "You can't watch me every moment," Catherine replied, "and you came when I called. That's what matters." But the incident had shaken them both. That evening, George spent a long time checking the locks on doors and windows, and Catherine noticed that he kept his rifle closer at hand than usual. They both understood that Wayne's visit had been more than simple harassment. It had been a declaration of intent, a promise that he would find another opportunity to act on his twisted desires. The next few days passed quietly, but the peace felt fragile, like the calm before a storm. George began teaching Catherine to shoot, insisting that she needed to be able to protect herself if he wasn't nearby. Catherine proved to be a surprisingly good marksman, her steady hands and patient temperament well suited to the precision required. "You're a natural," George observed as Catherine hit the center of the target for the third time in a row. "My mother always said I had good hands for detailed work," Catherine replied, reloading the rifle with movements that were becoming automatic. "It's more than that. You don't let emotion interfere with accuracy. That's a rare quality." Catherine lowered the rifle and looked at him seriously. "Do you really think Wayne will come back?" George was quiet for a moment, considering his words. "Yes," he said finally. "Men like Wayne don't forgive humiliation. He'll be back, and next time, he'll be better prepared. Then we'll be ready for him." The simple statement, delivered with quiet determination, filled George with pride and something deeper. Catherine was no longer the frightened woman who had stood on the auction block. She was becoming someone new, someone stronger, and George realized that his love for her had grown beyond anything he had thought possible. "Yes," he agreed, "we'll be ready." 2 weeks later, their preparations were put to the test. Wayne returned, but this time he didn't come alone. He brought 3 men with him, rough characters from the mining camps who were known for their willingness to do violence for pay. They arrived at dusk, when the fading light would make accurate shooting difficult. Catherine saw them first, dark shapes moving through the tree below the house. She called George immediately, and they took up positions they had practiced. George at the front windows, while Catherine covered the back of the house. "Cooper!" Wayne's voice carried clearly through the evening air. "Send out your wife. We just want to talk to her." George's response was to put a rifle bullet into the tree next to Wayne's head, close enough to shower him with bark. The message was clear. There would be no negotiation. What followed was a tense standoff that lasted through the night. Wayne's men tried several times to approach the house, but George and Catherine's accurate fire kept them pinned down. The attackers had expected to face one man protecting a helpless woman, not a coordinated defense by 2 skilled shooters. As dawn broke, Wayne realized that his plan had failed. His men were growing restless, and the longer they stayed, the greater the chance that someone from town would investigate the gunfire. With curses and threats of future vengeance, Wayne and his companions withdrew, but not before Wayne made his intentions clear. "This isn't over, Cooper," he shouted from the safety of the tree line. "You can't protect her forever." But Wayne had underestimated both George's determination and Catherine's transformation. The woman who had once stood trembling on an auction block was gone, replaced by someone who had found her strength and was prepared to fight for what was hers. The night of the attack had been a crucible that had burned away the last of Catherine's self-doubt, leaving behind steel tempered by adversity. In the days that followed, word of the attack spread through Millbrook like wildfire. The townspeople were divided in their reactions. Some condemned Wayne's actions and expressed support for the Coopers. Others whispered that Catherine must have done something to encourage Wayne's attention, that respectable women didn't find themselves in such situations. The division came to a head the following Sunday at church. Catherine had been reluctant to attend, knowing that she would be the subject of intense scrutiny, but George had insisted that they not allow Wayne's actions to drive them into hiding. They walked into the church together, George's hand resting protectively on Catherine's back, and took their usual seat near the front. Catherine could feel the weight of stares and whispered conversations, but she kept her head high and her expression serene. The minister's sermon that morning was about the parable of the Good Samaritan, about showing compassion to those in need regardless of social status or circumstances. Catherine wondered if the choice of topic was coincidental or if the minister was making a subtle statement about recent events. After the service, as the congregation filed out of the church, Patricia Martin approached them with her usual false smile. "Mrs. Cooper," she said loudly enough for others to hear, "I do hope you are recovering from your recent troubles." The emphasis on the word troubles made it clear that Patricia was fishing for information, hoping to gather details she could share with the other gossips. Catherine met her gaze steadily. "I'm quite well, thank you," but Catherine replied. "My husband and I are grateful for the support of our true friends during this difficult time." The implication was clear. Those who stood by them were friends, while those who spread gossip and innuendo were not. Several people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, recognizing themselves in Catherine's subtle rebuke. George stepped forward, his presence commanding attention without effort. "I want everyone to understand something," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the church steps. "My wife was the victim of an unprovoked attack by a man who refused to accept that she belongs to someone who values and protects her. Anyone who suggests otherwise is either ignorant of the facts or deliberately spreading malicious lies." The crowd fell silent, stunned by George's direct challenge to the gossips and rumor mongers. He had essentially drawn a line in the sand, forcing people to choose sides. "Furthermore," George continued, "Catherine has shown more courage and dignity in the face of adversity than most people display in a lifetime of comfort. I am proud to call her my wife, and anyone who questions her character will answer to me." With that, George offered Catherine his arm, and they walked away from the church together, leaving behind a crowd buzzing with shock and speculation. The public declaration was even more powerful than the one George had made in the general store weeks earlier. This time, he had not only defended Catherine's worth, but had done so in front of the entire community, including the minister and the town's most influential citizens. As they walked home, Catherine felt a surge of love and gratitude for the man beside her. George had risked his own reputation and social standing to defend her honor, had made it clear that an attack on her was an attack on him. The gesture was both protective and empowering, acknowledging her worth while also making it clear that she was not alone in the world. "Thank you," she said as they reached the edge of town. "For what?" "For seeing me as someone worth defending, for making it clear that I'm not just your property, but your partner." George stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression serious. "Catherine, you need to understand something. You were never my property. From the moment I bid on you at that auction, you were my choice, my equal, my beloved wife." The word beloved hung in the air between them, the first time either of them had used such an intimate term. Catherine felt her heart skip as she realized what George was telling her. "Beloved?" she repeated softly. "Yes, I love you, Catherine. I think I started falling in love with you that first night, when you sat by the fire mending my shirt and making my house feel like a home. I know it's soon, and I know our marriage began under unusual circumstances. But what I feel for you is real and deep and lasting." Catherine's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "I love you too," she whispered. "I was afraid to say it, afraid it was too soon or that you would think I was just grateful for your protection. Never think that. What we have is built on much more than gratitude or convenience. It's built on respect, partnership, and yes, love." They kissed there on the road between town and mountain, sealing their declaration with tenderness and passion. When they broke apart, both were smiling, and Catherine felt as though a weight had been lifted from her heart. The months that followed were the happiest of Catherine's life. She and George settled into a rhythm of partnership that encompassed every aspect of their lives. They worked together on the homestead, planned for the future together, and faced challenges as a united team. The love they had declared grew deeper and stronger with each passing day. Wayne Clark made no further direct attempts to harm them, but his presence remained a shadow on the edge of their happiness. He was often seen in town, drinking heavily and making increasingly wild threats against George and Catherine. Most people dismissed his ravings as the bitter complaints of a man who had lost face. but George and Catherine remained vigilant. Their caution proved justified when 6 months after the attack on their home, Wayne was found dead in his cabin, apparently from a combination of alcohol poisoning and exposure. Elizabeth Williams, now free from her abusive marriage, chose to remain in Millbrook and eventually found happiness with a kind widower who appreciated her gentle nature. The news of Wayne's death brought Catherine a complex mix of emotions. She felt relief that the threat was finally over, but also sadness for the waste of a human life consumed by bitterness and resentment. George, more pragmatically, simply observed that some people are their own worst enemies. As their first year of marriage drew to a close, Catherine reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her from the auction block to genuine happiness. She had learned that worth was not determined by beauty or circumstances, but by character and the love of those who truly knew you. She had discovered strengths she never knew she possessed and found a partner who saw her as an equal rather than a subordinate. On the anniversary of their wedding, George surprised Catherine with a gift that brought tears to her eyes. It was a portrait he had commissioned from a traveling artist, showing Catherine not as she had been on that terrible day at the auction, but as she was now, confident, radiant, and clearly beloved. "This is how I see you," George said as Catherine studied the painting. "This is who you've always been, even when you couldn't see it yourself." Catherine looked from the portrait to her husband's face, seeing the love and admiration in his eyes. The woman in the painting was beautiful, but it was the beauty that came from being truly seen and valued by another person. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything, for seeing me when I couldn't see myself, for choosing me when I thought I had nothing to offer, for showing me what love really means." George pulled her into his arms, holding her close against his chest. "Thank you for making my life complete, for bringing warmth to my cold mountain, for teaching me that the greatest wealth is not what you own, but who you love." As they stood together in their mountain home, surrounded by the life they had built together, Catherine understood that her story was not one of rescue, but of recognition. George had not saved her from her circumstances. He had seen her true worth when others could not, and in loving her, he had helped her see herself clearly for the first time. The kiss they shared was a promise and a celebration, a recognition of how far they had traveled together, and an anticipation of the journey still ahead. Outside their windows, the mountains stood eternal and protective, sheltering their love from the storms of the world below. In the end, Catherine realized the most beautiful thing was not the transformation itself, but the discovery that she had always possessed everything she needed to be worthy of love. George had simply been wise enough to see it, brave enough to claim it, and generous enough to nurture it until it bloomed into something magnificent. Their love story would be told in Millbrook for generations, but not as a tale of charity or rescue. Instead, it would be remembered as proof that true worth lies not in appearance or circumstances, but in the depth of character and the courage to love authentically. And every time someone recalled the moment when George Cooper kissed Catherine's hand in front of the entire town, they would remember not just his gallantry, but her quiet dignity in accepting it as her due.